See if we can get it back in its right spot. If I tip over, it's somebody else's fault. That's all I'm going to say. So, okay, welcome to our online audience. If you're joining us that way today, we're really glad that you're doing it. And if you're some of our local folks that are staying in out of the cold, I hope you're somewhere warm while you're watching this and enjoying that environment. Thanks for being here. Just a note, I also got to go again to districts, worked on the event there. I've done that every year since 2013, and thoroughly enjoy the energy and stuff of it, even though it takes me a little bit longer to recover every time that I come back from there. It's really inspiring, really good heart. To see all these young people that are interested in God and the things of God. And you hear me say it a lot around this event and also around Challenge. It just gives me a lot of hope for the present and the future. So really fun to be able to go do that. Well, if I were to say the phrase, your mission, should you choose to accept it, do you recognize that phrase? Does anybody remember where it comes from? Mission Impossible, yeah. So you may or may not know this, but the Mission Impossible series first aired on the CBS network from September 1966 to March 1973. It returned to television as a revival for 2 seasons on ABC from 1988 to 1990, and later inspired a very popular series of theatrical motion pictures, movies, starring Tom Cruise that began in the 1990s and are still going. I mean, I think there was another movie that just came out a year or two ago. Now, you might wonder, why did they use that particular phrase? Your mission, should you choose to accept it? In the series and in the movie, it was because there was a daunting challenge of some sort that was going to be put in front of the Impossible Missions Force, so the IMF in the show. And they, every time, had to choose whether or not they were up for attempting to accomplish this nearly or virtually impossible task. When I was in junior high and high school, the adult leader of our youth group, and particularly the guys portion of the youth group in church, used that phrase on us all the time. He would say about all sorts of things, your mission, should you choose to accept it, for all sorts of things. And I didn't have any connection to the TV show because I grew up without a television. So I thought he was just weird with weird ideas. That's kind of what a lot of youth leaders are like, right, Larry? Smart beyond their years. Okay, if you say so. But what I came to understand it to mean was that he was going to put in front of us some sort of task. It might be just for fun. It might be something serious. Sometimes it was work related. And the other side of the thing that I always learned that it was my choice, sort of, in those instances, my choice, sort of, whether I actually chose to do the task that he put in front of us or not. Most of the time, because I wasn't sure it was actually a choice, I just did. And most of the time it turned out to be good and fun and tiring and never earned me any money. But it was always a part of that. So I like to do at least once a year, I like to do a sermon series of various kinds and various natures annually that is based on our church mission statement and our church purpose and our church goals. And so we're going to start, a short series of sermons that are going to take a look at these statements that we have as a church. We're going to look at some of the biblical foundations or the biblical ideas behind them, why we chose to incorporate these things in the life of our church. And then also talk about or think about together how we can go about accomplishing these tasks that are in front of us. And I want to say that the heartbeat of the reason why I introduce things today with this Mission Impossible idea, this your task, should you choose to accept it, is because anytime there's a set of statements that relate to an organization of any kind, there is a choice that the people involved with the organization always make about, are they going to be a set of nice statements, or are they going to be things that the people that are involved in the organization actually attempt to do, attempt to live out, or attempt to work out? Are they going to be things that the organization will rally around and use as a rallying point to work together toward common good? So, before you decide that our mission statement is all about Mission Impossible, let me direct your thinking in just a couple of ways this morning. So you might wonder, well, what is a mission statement? What does a mission statement mean? Why might it be important to have a mission statement? Now, for some people, when they hear the word mission, they think missions. And they think about people in Africa and people that we send money to that go around the world to share the gospel and to do different kinds of work. And so some people therefore think, well, a mission statement really only relates to that, and if I'm not that, then I'm not sure it actually relates to me. But that's not what we mean when we talk about a mission statement. A mission statement really is a common goal, a common idea, a common statement that we have agreed together to rally around, to work on, to make our focus, and to attempt to do and accomplish in our organization, in our church, both corporately, as a group, and also as individuals. So, before I put it on the screen, I want to ask this question: what is our church mission statement? Anybody know? Oh, you did pretty well. Let's try it again together. Knowing Jesus and making Him known. Now, you might notice that this very creative statement that we stole and begged and borrowed from other sources because we believed it was true and because it really fit what we wanted to try to do as a church. You might notice that it breaks down into two connected but very distinct pieces or parts, right? So the first part relates to knowing Jesus, with the second part being about making Him known. And I would ask the question, what do we mean when we talk about this statement? Well, what we mean is that this is what is going to guide us, that we will work together on, that we will have this twofold purpose as a congregation, but also as parts of this congregation as we go through what we do as a church or as individuals. These are things that we want everything that we do as a church to somehow or another relate to this idea of knowing Jesus and making Him known. So for the rest of our time during my talk today, I'm going to focus our thinking around that very first phrase, knowing Jesus. And we're going to ask and think together, and I'm going to guide your thinking a little bit about how do we answer the question, what do we mean exactly when we talk about knowing Jesus? What is the idea and the heartbeat behind what we mean and what it might look like for us to engage in the process of knowing Jesus? Now, there are several instances that show up in the biblical text of the Christian Testament or the New Testament where Jesus references the same idea repeatedly. You find it occurring in different contexts, in different settings, and in different situations. In each one of them, it might have a slightly different application or a slightly different idea behind it, but still relating to the same basic core teaching that Jesus is trying to get across. One of the best summary statements of this idea that I want us to think about today can be found in the Gospel of Luke, the Bible book of Luke, chapter 6, verse 40. And Luke 6:40 reads this: students are not greater than their teacher. And it's in particular this second sentence that we'll focus on today. But the student who is fully trained will become like the teacher. How many of you have had teachers at some point in your life that had a great influence over your life? Some of you have had that kind of experience. It might have been in school. You might right now be thinking about an elementary teacher or a junior high teacher or a high school teacher. Maybe it was in college, something in that setting. But maybe it was on the job. Maybe it was somebody who taught you how to do the work that you do in the job that you do now, or in the job that you used to do if you're retired. Maybe it was somebody who did it in a less formal way and just came alongside of you and taught you something about life. They helped you learn how to do some life skill. They helped you figure out how to do certain things or manage certain things. These people are incredibly important in our lives for a variety of reasons, right? They help us learn and grow in ways that without their help we may have never learned and grown in those ways or in those areas. You know, we all learn certain things at certain points in life, largely based on what we're exposed to, and we're not all exposed to exactly the same kind of things, right? And so I moved here to Wisconsin when I was 32 years old, and I discovered that what they think a coat in Texas isn't actually a coat. Matter of fact, I learned that it's hardly adequate for cool weather, much less cold weather, right? And so one of the first things that happened when I moved here is some people took pity on me and decided to help me learn what it was like to live in the winter in Wisconsin, right? And some of them donated certain to me, and others took me to stores and said, ignore that stuff, buy this thing over here, right? Because this is what you're actually going to need in order to do well in Wisconsin in the winter. I didn't know there was a difference in coats. I didn't know you needed to wear layers to stay warm. I had never lived anywhere where that kind of thing was all that important to your survival and to you're living. Sometimes what you learn from a teacher is stuff like that, right? The stuff that just keeps you from freezing when you're out and about doing it. Well, when you look at this idea in this statement that Jesus makes, and by the way, you can find a form of this exact idea, this exact statement in Matthew chapter 10. You can also find it in John's Gospel in chapter 13, and again in chapter 15, as well as in this Luke 6:40 place, where Jesus says this idea either in the same context or in different contexts, trying to help people think and understand something about this notion, this idea of the importance of teachers or of being taught in our life. Now, in Luke chapter 6, verse 40, this statement occurs within the larger context of a well-known set of statements that Jesus made and that Jesus taught on. We commonly call them the Beatitudes, right? And if you've got a Bible and you're looking at your biblical text there might be a heading, if you looked at the right place, that says Beatitudes there. So in the middle of these teachings about life and these teachings about how to do life in the way that it should be done within the kingdom of God, right? Life done well and rightly as a follower of Jesus, you get this statement that Jesus makes. Now, it would seem obvious to us. I think in my mind, it was probably obvious to the group of people that first heard it. But just to make sure that we don't lack clarity on this, in this particular set of phrases, it is important to know who the teacher is and who the students are, right? Every now and then that gets a little confused. And in this context, the teacher is Jesus. And the students are all of those that are listening to him on this occasion, and or all who would listen to him, even through the written word, including those who would make a choice to be one of his followers, to learn and grow in his way. Now, it really teaches two core ideas, right? This is a twofold statement, sort of like our mission statement is a twofold statement. The idea that comes first is students aren't greater than, or they're not more important than their teacher in the sense of a learning teaching context, right? This is not suggesting that there's never any point in time that a student won't be somewhat on equal footing with somebody who's a teacher. As a matter of fact, this isn't even suggesting that there may not be a process by which those who are students now will be teachers later, right? It's amazing how many people go through the process of elementary school and junior high school and high school who decide when they're looking for a career farther out in their life, I want to go back and be a teacher among these students like someone was my teacher among these students. In a similar way, thinking about districts and or challenge conference, we see all kinds of people who came to districts and challenge conferences as students who come back as youth sponsors. Some of them come back as youth pastors or youth leaders in that sense. And some of them come back and work on event staff or work on challenge staff there. They move from the place of just being the student to that place where they're actually in more of a leadership role, a teaching role, a guiding sort of role. So simply put, this isn't like you're locked into this for all time, with one exception. And that's if Jesus is the teacher and we're the students. That is a relationship that we never actually graduate from, right? Jesus is always going to be the teacher. And we, in some senses of the word, are always going to be the students when it comes to our relationship with Him. They asked the students what did they enjoy, or what was some of the things that they learned at the conference. And if you're more curious about that, you can always approach one of them. They're not as scary as they seem. And you can approach one of them and ask them, well, what did you mean by this? What in particular was important? They'll probably ignore you, but I mean, it doesn't hurt to try, right? No, I'm kidding. They might be delighted to tell you something about what it is, and the role might get reversed where now the student becomes the teacher, explaining to you something about that. So here's the thing. As disciples, we're not ever going to be greater than our teacher, Jesus. But there is a goal in the teaching. And there is a goal that the teacher always has, and there is a goal that students of Jesus should always have. And that is this second sentence. This idea that when a student is fully trained, they will actually become like the teacher. They will take on some of the characteristics of, some of the knowledge of, some of the manners and ways of doing things that the teacher had. It's a funny thing to think about, but in life often we end up being a whole lot more like our parents than we would be willing to admit, right? And most of us have this scary experience where we realize at some point that we are saying to our kids things that we swore we would never say to our kids when we had them, right? Because we spend, at least under a lot of circumstances, kids spend X number of years under the influence of these people in our life who are our parents but are also teaching us. And we follow them, and we learn to do things, and we say things how they would say things, and with an expression and a tone of voice, and we do certain things in certain ways. What was I talking about? I don't know. Anyway, you go through that natural experience, right, as a child of a parent, where you sort of absorb some of this stuff. You become something because of that. Well, in this instance, what Jesus is saying is that it is normal in life for someone to become like the person who is teaching or instructing them in certain ways. And it should be normative in the disciple, follower of Jesus category, where we become like Jesus. Now, don't make a mistake. We're not going to ascend to being the very Son of God, right? I mean, we're not going to become perfect. We're not going to be able to know the future. We're not going to be able to know what people are thinking. Well, except for when your spouse gives you that look, and then you might know what they're thinking, right? But I mean, we're not saying become the very Son of God. We're just saying that as followers of Jesus, if we're following Him well, if we're being good students, if we're learning and growing and continuing to learn and grow in Him, if we're knowing Jesus, we will continually be in the process of becoming like Him as our teacher. We will follow His patterns and behaviors. Just a couple of interesting phrases here for you to think about. In the Greek language, the phrase that we get fully trained here, in the Greek language would have carried the idea of being perfected or being completed. And what it referenced in the general language, in a general context, was something being broken and repaired back to the place where it was totally usable again, right? That it would be put back to a place of completeness, a place of usability again. And so when Jesus talks about a student being fully trained, that references this idea that with paying attention to Christ, learning of Christ, knowing Jesus, right? That we start to take on these qualities that result in us appearing enough like what we're supposed to be like, that we are perfected or completed in that sense of the word. The Bible Knowledge Commentary says this about this phrase, says, Jesus noted that a person becomes like the one who they emulate or imitate. Therefore, his disciples are being challenged, being invited to emulate or imitate the teacher. If you were to look in a dictionary at the word emulate, you would find this definition. It means to try to equal or excel, or it means to imitate with effort to equal or surpass. Some of the synonyms of this word are copy or follow or imitate. The idea is a very, very, very core idea to what knowing Jesus really and truly means. Now, what we know from history and from the biblical text is that Jesus spent about 3, maybe 3.5 years doing what is considered his public ministry. And also, it was during that period of time where he had selected those individuals who were going to be specifically known as his disciples or the apostles in a very specific sense. And what happened during that period of time with Jesus and those disciples was mostly about them getting to know him. Them coming to understand more completely and more fully who he was, getting to know his values, getting to know the ways that he thought about things and the ways that he did things, so that they could do what they saw and experienced and heard Jesus teaching. This primarily happened through all of the time that they spent together. I mean, I hope you realize that the Gospels don't record every instant of the life of Jesus or of his disciples, right? Not everything that transpired is in there, and not all of the individual conversations that went on, the time sitting around the dinner tables where they were just talking about what had happened that day and what did it mean. I mean, we get a look at some of that, enough to know that that happened a lot, but we don't see all of those. But what we get in the Gospels is enough to tell us, hey, the way that they got to be like their teacher, the way that they learned enough about him and who he was just through all of this time that they spent together going and doing all of these things. Now, one might say, well, it was easier for them because they had that extra time, right? And they actually saw it with their own eyes, and they could ask questions of Jesus and learn from him. And I mean, I sort of agree in the sense that, yeah, we weren't there for it to happen. We weren't there to watch and observe and ask questions. And there's undoubtedly things that transpired that we don't even know about that they were involved in. However, what I do believe about the biblical text is that everything that we need to know for life and faith as a believer is recorded for us. That there's enough there for us to see the patterns and understand what it is that we need to know, what patterns it is that we need to follow. So how does one know Jesus now? How does one go about the process of knowing, continuing action word, knowing Jesus? Well, I would suggest it happens by time spent with Him, just like it did for them. Time spent reading about Him and about what He's like and about what He did and what He said and how He interacted with people and how He related the things of God in a human story. All of this stuff is contained in the 4 gospel accounts that we have about the life of Jesus. It's one of the reasons why I highly recommend that anybody who wants to be a follower of Jesus, who wants to be a disciple of Jesus, needs to set aside some regular time to read about who He is and what He's like and how He did certain things and what things were really, really important to Him and what things that He never even mentioned or never even talked about. I would suggest setting aside some regular time every day at a minimum to read something of the biblical text. And if you're wanting to get to know Jesus better, I would strongly encourage you to focus your reading on the Christian Testament, or what we call the New Testament of the Bible. There are all kinds of reading plans out there. I like the YouVersion Bible app. I enjoy it, and you can go and find all these different reading plans. You can even set your mobile device to yell at you in the morning when it's time to read, or whenever you set up your time, right? And I vary what I do, and this year I'm doing a reading plan that I'll spend this next year reading some every day in the Christian Testament, in the New Testament. And right now, they start kind of at the beginning. So right now I'm reading through Matthew, and I'm just reading the story of Jesus. I'd say that's probably a minimum thing to get to know Jesus well, is to spend a little time reading. And if you don't love to read, there's this amazing thing out there called audio Bibles and audio books. And if you've got the YouVersion app, you can have it read it to you. So you could be driving down the highway and listening to it, or riding around in the tractor or whatever when you had time and space to listen instead of read. It's still about taking that in. And then I would also suggest that it also happens by time spent with Him, by talking with Him. And we would commonly call that prayer, but I would suggest that sometimes we don't realize that prayer is really just, in essence, talking to God, talking to Jesus. And like any good conversation, it might also mean waiting to hear something back from them. And yes, I think that Jesus still interacts with us in that ways. And sometimes He talks back to us through His written word, and in other ways if we're willing to listen. It's probably best to think about it like, how do I go about getting to know anybody? Well, the way that we go about getting to know anybody in our life is through time spent together in curiosity, and time spent together in fun, and time spent together deliberately making efforts to get to know the other person in a deeper way. Now, just one more text, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but if you go a little bit farther into Luke chapter 6, you get to verses 46 to 49, right? And Jesus makes a statement, and then He tells a story. Okay, and the statement is in verse 46, so why do you keep calling me Lord, Lord, when you don't do what I say? Okay, so Jesus is talking about a context where there were lots of people that were just interested in the amazing stuff He could do and weren't really interested in Him. And they were just around for the show, and they weren't greatly interested in learning to be a follower of His. And then there were other people who had some interest in being a follower of His. They just didn't fully understand that, hey, Being a follower of me means more than just listening to me. Being a follower of me means listening to, taking in what I'm saying, and then doing something that looks like what Jesus was saying and doing. And then he gives this illustration. Verse 47 says, I'll show you what it's like when someone comes to me, listens to my teaching, and then follows it. Okay? So he's saying, here's an example of what it looks like. You've heard this story before. You might have even, if you grew up in church, you might have even sang a funny little Sunday school song with motions to the idea that's in these words. But Jesus says it's like a person building a house who digs deep and lays the foundation on solid rock. And when floodwaters or anything bad, anything serious rises and breaks against that house, it stands firm because it's well built. And then he says this, but anyone who hears and doesn't obey, right? Anyone who thinks that it's enough just to hear the word of Jesus and ignore what the content is or not attempt to do some of it would fit in this category. It's like a person who built a house right on the ground. It probably literally means on the earth or on the sand would probably be a more common understanding of it without any foundation. And Jesus says the natural result in that case, because the foundation isn't solid, a flood will sweep down and the result will be the complete collapse of the house. So Jesus is simply giving an illustration that those who make a choice to listen to what he says, get to know him by listening to what he has to say, and then doing the stuff that he talks about and teaches, are able to succeed in that because they build their life on a solid foundation. On the solid foundation of Jesus and his teachings, on the person of who he is and what he's like. And Jesus says it's totally possible to listen and not do what you're told and build a house that won't stand up. It's totally possible to find that kind of a reality. In this text, Jesus is simply saying, I am the solid foundation. Not I, Todd, I, Jesus, is the solid foundation upon which lives, particularly the lives of those who follow him, need to be built. In order for us to really effectively know Jesus or be in that posture of knowing Jesus, we need to be in that process of continuing to know him well enough to build our lives rooted in him and who he is. He also reminds the reality that to do something else would potentially be inviting disaster as it relates to what building a life on. So a part of what we mean when we say knowing Jesus is that we are going to make a conscious choice as a congregation, a conscious choice as individuals to build our lives modeled after and upon the foundation of who he is and what he is like and what his ways are. Again, something that would be a mission impossible if we don't spend the time to learn more about him and to learn more about his ways. Ironically, in verse 42, which is a verse in between 40 and 46, you probably deduced that already, is where Jesus challenges the people and his disciples that they need to take care of their own stuff before they can try to fix other people. It's the story about don't try to take a splinter out of somebody else's eye when you've got a big log sticking out of yours, right? With the teaching being, pay attention to your own stuff. Meaning that there are things that we can do corporately to work together toward the goal of knowing Jesus. There are things that we can offer to help you in the process of knowing Jesus. But ultimately, at the end of the day, that will be your own thing. And that will be your own choice that you make as to whether that will be the case in your life or whether or not that will be the case in our church as a whole. Deal with your own stuff and that. Now, back to the idea that Jesus teaches us in verse 40, and then we're done. The New English Translation commentary says this about that phrase that Jesus teaches us. It says, teachers build followers who go the same direction that they do. Teachers build followers who go the same direction as they do. Let me suggest to you that that's part of the reason why Jesus said what he said, was so that we would know and understand we always have stuff to learn from him, but we always have things to do in life that will move us toward doing things more like Jesus did them. That is at least part of the reason why our mission statement starts with knowing Jesus first, before it talks about what else we will do with that reality. We need to know Jesus more effectively before we can help anybody else know Jesus more and to greater extent. We need to know him before we can help build other followers who will go the same direction as Jesus does. Well, our mission statement is, again, will you say it out loud with me? Knowing Jesus and making him known. I want to encourage you to spend some time this week exploring in your own heart and in your own mind, what would it look like for me to be in the process of knowing Jesus more? What do I already do that would help me with that? What do I need to add to my life that would help with that? And of course, I would be glad to have a conversation with you about that if you want to converse about that. My guess is any of our church elders or many of the spiritually mature ladies would be glad to have conversations about that. But just let me remind you, spend ample time getting to know Jesus and start building your life on the kind of person he is and the kind of things that he does. And if you're watching online or you're sitting in this room and you're not a Jesus follower or you're not sure where you're at in that whole spectrum, I would suggest to you that the best thing you can know is get to know Jesus. The best thing you can do in terms of activity is get to know him. And so I would challenge you, even if you don't consider yourself a disciple or a follower of Jesus, to find a biblical text and look at the gospel stories about who he is. That's where you will come to know who he really is and what he's really all about. And most importantly, that's where you'll come to find out just how deeply he loves all of us, but even you, if you're in a place of not being a believer. Join me in a prayer, if you will. And so, Father, thank you that Jesus was not aloof or set apart from those that he ministered to, not aloof and set apart from us, but instead lived a life that was worthy of imitating, emulating, lived a life that was worthy of patterning ourselves after that. Thank you that in your divine wisdom you chose to have it recorded so that we could go and look and read and explore just exactly who Jesus is and what he's like. And so, Lord, I pray that as your followers who are a part of Reeve Church, that we would really renew our commitment, that we would make the choice to take on the task again this year of what it looks like to know you. So we pray to that end today. In Jesus' name, amen. At this time, if you're able, would you please stand and join the worship team as they lead us in a song to wrap up our service today.